I want to finish just articulating what exactly was the greatest failure, counterintelligence failure in the United States. So we have this tendency of corruption. We can look at Ukraine like a model. It's like a test. It's smaller, so it's easier to look at. And it's kind of like the United States, but in the future, fast forward. Ukraine, through Viktor Yanukovych, who was put in there essentially as a puppet president. And the people of Ukraine, my hat goes off to them. They got out in the streets in 2014 and they pretty much peacefully did it. And they wouldn't leave until he got out of town and they had their vote. And they did it peacefully.
Remember how Yanukovych got in? His campaign manager was Paul Manafort, who, of course, became Trump's campaign manager. And Manafort got $75 million, essentially, from Putin and pro-Russian oligarchs.
So we look at Ukraine. Ukraine is a kleptocracy. It's gone to the end stages of corruption. Nobody argues about the corruption. Russia is very similar. They're brothers, right? They're fighting each other. It's a brothers' war. All we have to do is look at Ukraine to see what's happening to the United States. It was going to happen to the United States. And I've been talking about this for years, going back at least when I started working Ukraine Matters in 2017. We look at Ukraine through the lens of Russian counterintelligence, because they've been using Ukraine as a buffer, operating through Ukraine for many years now. They didn't need to invade Ukraine. That's ridiculous. They already controlled Ukraine through the oligarchs. The other stuff was all narrative to try to justify breaking down NATO and expanding the Soviet empire. So the FBI was the only organization that works effectively federal public corruption, okay? So if you take away the FBI or you encumber it in some way, or you set up a system of rules that is so ridiculously difficult to follow, you're going to tie their hands. They're not going to be able to do public corruption investigations anymore. And then it's just going to become a failed state, just Russia, Ukraine, not failed yet, but they're on the brink of failure and they're completely corrupted. One of the first things that Trump did was he got rid of the inspectors generals. I think it was 6 right away, right off the bat. So getting rid of these internal control systems, FBI is like a fire break for corruption. Yeah, counterterrorism investigations matter, all these things matter, but what I eventually realized that our greatest threat was public corruption. Because if we fall apart and fracture from within, if we can't keep ourselves together, there's no country. And there's no country that can go up against us in military might. If you take away the FBI, you take away the fire break, there's nothing to stop the fire from spreading. And there's a fire break within the fire break. This would be like one of those single points of failure. And that's the inspection division within the FBI and internal affairs. And they're the division that people go to if they see a problem with a manager, a problem with a biased manager, for example. They go to the inspection division and say, hey, this person appears to be acting biased and he's letting his bias affect the way intelligence is being collected and reported. He's letting his bias change the input of intelligence. That's what I reported to the inspection division inside the FBI, and they buried it. A year and a half went by. That's when I realized I have to expand. That's when I went to Congress. That was buried. I went to the House Select Committee for the Weaponization of the U.S. government, Jim Jordan directly. That was the appropriate committee. I took my information there. That was suppressed. They violated their own ethics rules by not sharing it with Democratic members of the committee. I gave them 3 months. They didn't do anything, so they expanded to my 22-page statement to the Senate Judiciary through Senator Whitehouse's office, and that was leaked, and things are history from there, and it took on a life of its own. What I was trying to do was highlight bias within the FBI is a big deal. If you have people who are putting their fingers on the scale and affecting the way that intelligence is collected on the left or the right, we got problems. It's not blind lady justice. It's justice looking underneath the blindfold. And that's what I believe happened. And that's what I blew the whistle on. They went after me in every possible way. They took the eye off the ball, and the inspection division failed. They suppressed it, and they decided to go after me instead. Instead of looking at the managers, taking a good, strong look at the managers all the way up the line. And this thing went higher than I realized. They went all the way to the director, as I found, Director Christopher Wray. The last day in the office, I emailed him directly, told him exactly what was going on, asked for help. 11 days later, my house was raided. I didn't even receive a phone call. He could have called me and said, hey, what's going on? Or sent somebody to call me. Instead of asking me what's going on, they raided my house. There were about 20 people with guns. And one of them pointed it at my son's face. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, why didn't you just come to me? I don't want to interview me. To this day, I've never had a legitimate interview. I've only had an interview at the U.S. Attorney's Office. FBI's never interviewed me. Not when they raided my house, not when they arrested me and pulled off that stunt using a false affidavit in New York, where I spent one night as a political prisoner in a Brooklyn prison. They didn't interview me. Never tried to interview me. Look, an investigator, I've heard hundreds of cases. You always end with the interview. At least try to interview the subject. Sometimes you don't. And there's only one reason why you wouldn't interview the subject. And that's if your case is so flimsy and so weak that getting information from the subject could screw up your case, could increase your burden of proof. So they have taken on a policy of silence with me and hands off, really, except for when they did their stunt. So that's where the failure happened, though. And that's what we're talking about as the greatest failure in counterintelligence in U.S. history. The center control system to prevent the FBI from falling into chaos and ruin and falling, essentially, was the inspection division. It failed. I went to Congress. It was buried. I went to the inspector general, buried. And then they weaponized the government and prosecuted me for one misdemeanor count for disclosure of confidential information. I still am not sure exactly what specific instance they're talking about. I should know this. I'm being prosecuted. I honestly do not even understand what they're prosecuting me for because my information had already been leaked to the media. But anyways, the FBI's internal control system failed. And then the FBI essentially failed. And now we're seeing what happens.